6 meters of stone and lime, a wall that seemed beyond the power of even nature itself to collapse. But the Romans advanced, not because they could, but because they did not acknowledge the impossible. Amidst the roar of the wind and the blare of horns, dozens of machines approached the fortress, each one like the embodied will of the empire. When the first ballista strike shattered the top of the tower, a whistle cut through the air, short like a breath before death. And have you ever wondered what sound a stone makes when it is torn apart by a force equal to the impact of a modern artillery shell? Polybius wrote that during the siege of Amphipolis, Roman throwers pierced walls 3 human heights thick. This is not hyperbole. Archaeologists found traces of stone projectiles weighing 80 kilograms, embedded in the masonry to a depth of almost half a meter. These machines, created not for defense but for progressive destruction, were called torsion catapults. Inside them, bundles of twisted sinews from bulls or horses were stretched, an elastic force accumulated in the muscles of animals now working against living people. The term torsion machine comes from the Latin torsio, twisting. This is not just a mechanism, it is a muscle transformed into a weapon. When its lever was released, energy was unleashed instantly, hurling stones hundreds of meters. Imagine this moment: the midday heat, the smoke of pitch, grease on the machine's wooden shoulders, a taut string, the hum of metal. The catapult pauses as if breathing, and then a strike. The ground trembles. Dust, stones, debris, everything mixes in a cloud of grey death. One volley and an entire section of the wall turns into a pile of dust. Such machines were commanded by a special officer, the prefect of engineering forces. His subordinates, ballistarii, were not just soldiers, but masters of precision. Their work was akin to a game with fate, an error in calculations and the projectile ricochets, breaking their own fortifications. The Romans measured angles using simple sights and plumb bobs, and the distance to the target by steps, calibrated by thousands of marches. But behind every strike lay yet another force: discipline. Without it, no catapult would have withstood the long days of siege. Warriors toiled under the sun, slept next to the machines, patched cracked beams, replaced stretched sinews. The stench of burning and blood became the smell of work for them. The Romans did not just destroy walls, they studied them. A surgeon studied a patient's body. Thickness, mortar composition, tower placement, everything was taken into account. Sometimes, to weaken the defense, legates ordered subs to be dug and machines to be placed in close positions, even under enemy arrows. Caesar wrote that during the siege of Alesia, his ballistas operated almost at point-blank range. They approached the Gallic fortifications so closely. But what compelled these men to advance under falling stone blocks with no chance to dodge? The answer lies not only in their loyalty to the empire. Somewhere in the heart of every catapult is men's desire to prove that nothing created by hands can withstand reason. And while dust still swirls above the walls, and Roman engineers hastily reposition their machines, a new weapon is maturing in the air, more precise, more destructive, almost alive in its fury. It is this that will transform siege warfare from a craft into an art, and the fortress into dust. The Romans knew victory in a siege began long before the first shot. Even before the legions approached enemy walls, engineers, fabricators, received orders to build siege machines directly on the march. The legions moved not only with weapons, but also with sawmills, forges and wagons loaded with ropes and bronze clamps. Polybius wrote that each army carried up to 300 wagons with materials. This was a mobile factory, stretched out for many kilometers. When the column approached the city, centurions measured out the site for the camp. First, a rampart and ditch were erected, followed by the engineers' tents. At night, the clang of hammers and the creak of blocks could be heard. Machines were being born that would begin to break down walls within 24 hours. Here began labor requiring as much endurance as battle. The most powerful of these weapons was the ballista. It was a gigantic crossbow-like device, launching stone projectiles and iron bolts the length of a man. Its arms, 2 twisted strands of sinews, were tensioned with winches. One pull and the projectile shot into the sky with a speed comparable to a bullet's flight. Archaeological findings in Carthage and Masada show traces of ballista impacts that pierced walls up to 6 meters thick. This type of weapon was called scorpion. The name was accurate, the strike was swift, deadly and precise. When tensioned, the levers arched like the tail of an insect ready to sting. Such machines were used not only for destroying fortifications but also for pinpoint elimination of defenders on the walls. A Scorpio bolt pierced through shield, armor and body. For these mechanisms to operate in concert, legates created entire batteries. Each consisted of 10 to 15 machines arranged in a line. Commanders gave signals with flags to synchronize volleys. The hum was like continuous thunder, and the walls began to tremble not only from the impacts but also from the fear of those who stood behind them. But all this required time and precision. One extra turn on a twisted sinew and the ballista lost power. One break in a beam and the entire crew perished from the machine's explosion. Caesar mentioned in his writings how near Alesia an entire team died when a torsion spring snapped under load. This was a weapon demanding respect and obedience. Roman engineers, architects of war, checked every detail. Ropes were soaked in vinegar and grease so they wouldn't dry out under the sun. Wood was boiled in oil. Metal elements were tempered on site using portable forges. Sometimes even captives were forced to work at the anvils, not out of mercy, but so that the hands of enemies would build their own end. Surprisingly, there was also a cold calculation in this. Such machines were expensive. Historians believe that one ballista cost the treasury an amount equivalent to a legion's annual pay. They were preserved, transported, disassembled, and after a siege, repaired and reused. The empire could not afford to lose technologies, only to multiply them. But machines were only part of the picture. The true strength of Rome lay in how precisely these machines fit into the army's rhythm. When ballistas struck, infantry moved under their cover. When arrows broke through the breach, archers responded with a volley, every action like the heartbeat of a single organism. And as the siege towers slowly approached the walls, to the rumble of drums and the smell of burning pitch, everything around became the arena for one question. Could human reason overcome the stone erected against it? The Romans already knew the answer, but they had to prove it on a field where every mistake was paid for with blood. The first day of a siege always began with silence. Before dawn, the smell of tar and raw wood hung over the camp. Legionaries in leather armor tightened ropes, greased screws, checked stops. When the sun touched the horizon, trumpets heralded the beginning, and the silence broke. A dense hum of machines rolled across the plain, as if the earth itself began to speak the language of war. Historians wrote that during the siege of Numancia in 133 BC, the walls trembled under dozens of throwing machines. First, ballistas struck, followed by catapults. Unlike their torsion counterparts, the catapult launched not stones, but clay vessels with burning mixtures or heavy, bronze-fletched arrows. The term catapult itself came from the Greek kata, against, and palein, to hurl, a machine created to hurl death into the face of the enemy. One of the legionaries, according to Appian, compared this sound to a thunderstorm. When the catapults fire, thunder answers them from inside the walls. Each hit was accompanied by a shower of debris and the cries of the defenders. The wind carried the smell of burnt pitch and lime. Stone blocks, once smooth and even, now cracked like dry skin. The Romans employed a tactic of continuous pressure. Strikes came every few minutes, changing direction so the enemy could not reinforce weak points. Catapults were positioned at an angle, firing in an arc. Projectiles fell behind the walls, destroying courtyards and inner fortifications. Each shot like a hammer blow to the enemy's nerves. The commander of the siege line, legate Marcus Claudius Marcellus, according to Livy, observed the firing from a hill. His task to coordinate the machines, like a conductor with an orchestra. When smoke enveloped the field, he gave the signal to advance the towers. These wooden behemoths, clad in hides and wet felts, slowly moved forward. Inside, soldiers climbed ladders, carrying shields and torches. Each siege tower was a mobile fortress as tall as a 5-story building. It was protected by metal plates and vinegar-soaked hides to deflect flaming arrows. Such constructions were called testudo turris, turtle tower. The name spoke for itself. Slowly, inexorably it approached under a hail of arrows. On each tower stood a ballista crew, a small detachment of 8 men, one loaded, 2 tensioned, 1 aimed, the rest serviced the mechanism. Their faces were covered in soot, fingers sticky with grease, but their eyes remained cold. For them, there was no wall, only target and calculation. With each passing minute, the attack intensified. The ground in front of the fortress turned into a level plain, strewn with stone fragments and bodies. When a section of the wall cracked, sappers with hooks and shovels moved towards the breach. They tore stones from the masonry, turning the crack into a passage, but this was only the first barrier. Behind the outer wall often stood a second, taller and thicker. And then the ballistas began to fire again, changing angle and height. The impacts merged into a continuous roar. The wind drove dust, obscuring the sun. It seemed as if nature itself resisted, but the machines continued to work, as if powered not by fuel, but by stubbornness. Those who survived under these walls recalled, the noise was so great that soldiers stopped hearing commands. They oriented themselves by gestures like mutes. And yet, discipline did not collapse, because every legionary knew, ahead was not just a battle, but a trial that would prove that man is capable of subduing even stone. While the wall cracked and crumbled, deep within the camp, engineers prepared something greater, a weapon that would be capable of breaching what seemed impregnable even to the gods. When the first breaches were made, the Romans moved to the second phase, the assault. This was the moment when iron discipline clashed with chaos. Siege machines fired their last volleys, knocking out the upper parts of the walls to clear the way for the infantry. Dust, smoke and stones obscured the sun, and the entire field in front of the fortress turned into a grey sea, where only the commands of centurions and the screech of ropes stretched to their limit could be heard. The historian Diodorus wrote that at this moment ballistas hurled projectiles with such speed that a person could not dodge. Stone projectiles weighing 80 kilograms pierced walls as a spear pierces flesh. But the machines continued to work even after the wall crumbled. Now they struck deep into the city, destroying towers, ceilings, stairs. Thus the Romans turned the enemy's defense into their own trap. At the forefront, battering rams covered by movable shelters were advanced. These were called vineae. These were huge wooden shelters on wheels, clad in hides and wet felts, under which dozens of soldiers swung a massive log with an iron tip, caput bovis, the head of a bull. One strike and the lime masonry trembled. 10 strikes, and stones flew out from under the walls, like teeth from an old skull. When the first ray of light appeared in the breach, a trumpet sounded the signal impetum, attack. Warriors lined up under the standard and advanced, covered by shields. Their dense formation, resembling a turtle's shell, was called a testudo. From above, stones rained down on them, boiling liquids poured, but the shields held. Wood, metal, flesh, and will merged into one mass. From the top of the ruined wall, enemies hurled spears, rolled down burning barrels, shouted, but the Romans moved step by step. Each blow of the ram brought closer the moment when the wall would collapse. And then it shuddered, as if exhaling, and collapsed to the roar of thousands of voices. Tacitus wrote that in such moments a man forgot fear. The assault turned into a ritual, a step, a breath, a strike. Everything else vanished. Even death nearby did not frighten, because everyone knew, behind him was the empire, ahead, eternity. When the breach was finally taken, the siege towers began to move. Their wheels bogged down in debris, but internal winches raised bridges, connecting the towers to the walls. The legions climbed up, and the battle transitioned into close combat. Stones, crossbow bolts, and fire now lost their significance. The strength of hands took over. But even here, technology did not retreat. Small scorpions were installed on the towers, light-throwing machines firing bolts at the attackers. This was a prototype of sniper weaponry. A shot, and a defender falls from the wall. Commanders used such machines to clear areas before their men advanced. While the battle raged, engineers continued to work in the rear. They repaired damaged machines right on site, under the cover of leather shields. Sometimes, from the wreckage of one ballista, two were created, smaller but still deadly. This was the philosophy of the Roman army: throw nothing away, turn everything into a tool. By evening the smoke had cleared. From beyond the walls came groans, the crackle of burning beams, the fall of stones. The Romans did not celebrate. They fortified positions, moved catapults closer, preparing them for a possible counterattack. And when it seemed that all was over, the smell of oil and burnt sinews rose into the air again. This meant that the machines were being prepared for a new volley, because for Rome, the assault never ended at the wall. The real battle always began beyond it. By morning, bluish smoke hung over the ruins of the fortress. Silence was no longer a sign of peace, it was the exhaustion after destruction. But the Romans knew no rest. The siege did not end with the fall of the wall. Now, chaos had to be turned into order, so that victory would have meaning. The legions occupied the inner courtyards, and engineers inspected the ruins, checking which machines could be repaired, which dismantled. Everything had value, even debris. Metal was melted down, wood was dried, animal sinews were again gathered into tight bundles for new torsions. Polybius wrote that after every victory, the Romans conducted an inventory of their machines. For them, war was not only battle, but also production. One prefect noted, "Every bolt is a coin of the empire." This revealed the essence of Roman thinking, rational, almost ruthless. And in this lay their strength. They did not just destroy cities, they learned from every Ballista strike. Captured enemy engineers became a source of new ideas. The Romans were not shy about borrowing. Greek catapults, Carthaginian towers, Egyptian battering rams. Everything was re-engineered, improved and returned to battle. Archaeological excavations in Numantia and Jerusalem show how constructions gradually became more compact and precise. Machines, once capable of throwing only stones, now hurled fire. The first documented use of incendiary projectiles was by Caesar. He wrote that in Gaul, warriors threw vessels with burning pitch and sulfur, which burst upon impact, spreading flames. This principle foreshadowed Greek fire, a weapon that would later change naval warfare. Siege technology transcended eras. From the art of destruction, it transformed into a science. In these smoky ruins, one could feel the breath of the future. The dust had not yet settled, but work was already bustling in the camp. Legionaries moved the remains of ballistas, masters drew new blueprints in the sand. Hammers rang in the air, like the heart of the empire, continuing to beat in the rhythm of mechanics. For Rome fought not only with men, but with reason. Tacitus wrote that Roman engineers treated a machine as a general treated an army, every detail a soldier, every section of rope a strategy. The lives of thousands depended on it. In ancient treatises, the term ratio belli, the reason of war, is found. It meant not just tactical calculation, but a philosophy where intellect must conquer chaos. And this is precisely what distinguished the Romans from all those they besieged. But destruction also had a flip side. When a fortress fell, its inhabitants, exhausted and covered in ash, emerged with raised hands. The Romans rarely left walls standing. They destroyed them to their foundations, so that no one could rise against the empire again. Fire crept across wooden roofs. Statues of gods fell, and the dust raised by the siege mingled with the smoke of temples. Thus silence was born. Not peace, but emptiness. However, in this gloom, a new era of engineering genius was also maturing. The same principles that broke walls later built aqueducts, bridges, and arches. Torsion force, once used to hurl stones, came to be used in construction winches. The Roman siege machine was the progenitor not only of artillery, but of all modern mechanics. Even Leonardo da Vinci, a millennium and a half later, would draw ballistas, repeating the principles derived by Caesar and Vitruvius. And yet, the more Rome perfected its technology, the more it depended on it. The empire, built on mechanisms, did not notice how it itself became part of a huge machine, rigid, rational, but vulnerable. When the barbarians came, they had no catapults, but they had a force against which iron does not save. A desperate belief that everything can be destroyed, even the invincible. And when, in the 4th century AD, the last Roman engineers recorded the dimensions of their ballistas, they probably already felt that their time was passing. But the machines, which once taught men to break stone, would remain with him forever, because where man seeks a way to breach a wall, he inevitably becomes a little Roman. And yet, the question posed at the beginning remains open. What is stronger, human reason, which creates destruction, or the will that compels it to continue, even when surrounded by ruins? All that remained of the wall was a pile of stones and a shadow of dust, slowly settling to the ground. But the history of Roman siege machines did not end in ashes. On the contrary, it was precisely after each destroyed fortress that the empire became smarter, more precise, more rational. Rome did not just conquer, it systematized the very concept of war. And where others saw chaos, the Romans saw regularity. After the siege of Gergovia, where Caesar suffered a rare defeat, he ordered a review of the entire system of engineering support. Machines became lighter, the frames more mobile, and torsion bundles were replaced at the first signs of wear. Vitruvius, an architect and engineer, described how the experience of combat engineers was transformed into a set of rules: the distance between the ballista's axles, the proportions of the arms, the optimal firing angle. Every victory and every defeat was recorded, like a line in the empire's book of reason. The ballista became not just a weapon, it became a symbol of power. On the bas-reliefs of Trajan's column, Roman artillerymen can be seen working at the walls of Dacia. There, precision, calibration, cold confidence. The empire transformed destruction into a craft, perfected it to a point where even chaos submitted to geometry. But if one looks deeper, beyond the mechanisms, formulas, and clang of metal, one can see something more. Roman engineers created not only weapons, but also a principle. Any obstacle can be calculated, any stone, overcome through reason. It was this idea that passed through the centuries, giving rise not only to cannons and catapults, but also to bridges, telescopes, steam engines. It all began with those who tried to breach 6 meters of stone. Archaeological findings confirm, after each campaign, the parts of siege machines were carefully stored. Fragments of ballistas were found in the excavations of Masada, which almost 2,000 years later still bore traces of bronze fastenings. This means that each machine had a passport, its own history. It traveled with the legions from province to province. They were not just built, they lived with the army. But behind these ingenious mechanics stood people, those who risked raising ropes under fire, who stood beneath walls when stone blocks fell on them. Soldier engineers, whose names have not reached us, were the true heroes of this war with matter. They knew the sound of impact when 80 kilograms of stone crashed into a wall. They knew the smell of rope soaked in blood and vinegar. They knew that victory was not loud glory, but the creak of blocks and the smell of burning. One ancient source writes that the Romans treated a siege like a medical operation. Doctors of war, they cut through the tissues of the walls until the city surrendered. Everything that could not be cured was removed. This metaphor seems frighteningly accurate, for Rome treated the world with fire and iron, but ultimately became infected with its own thirst for control. When the empire weakened, its enemies adopted what had once made Rome invincible. The Byzantines created new versions of catapults and scorpions, and later crossbows and trebuchets. Even in the Middle Ages, 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, engineers still measured tension force and arm length according to the same principles as Vitruvius. Rome died, but its mechanical soul continued to live in every castle, in every stone brought down by human assault. Ultimately, the question remains not about the machines, but about us. For when the Romans breached those 6-meter walls, they fought not only with stone, but with the limits of human imagination. They proved that thought can become a weapon, that an idea can demolish cities. And in this lies their greatness and their curse. Tacitus wrote, "Everything that man creates will one day turn against him." In these words, the fate of the empire. The machines that created Rome became a symbol of its pride. They taught humanity to destroy, but also showed the price of reason without measure. And when the last ballistas fell silent, their echo long resonated in minds, as a reminder that even perfection can lead to ruin. But still, when one looks at the stone projectiles found in excavations or at Vitruvius's drawings, one feels not horror, but admiration. Because this is a testament to human will, a will that does not surrender to the impossible. And now, knowing how these Roman machines broke walls 6 meters thick, it remains only to ask yourself, what is your wall today? The one you consider impenetrable? All that is needed to destroy it is reason, discipline, and a step forward. Just as 2 millennia ago, when amidst the hum of ballistas and the cracking of stone, the Romans proved to the whole world that boundaries exist only until someone decides to break them,